Give me financial advice, and I might actually tip you for it. The words landed lightly, almost playful, but the laughter that followed was not. It rolled across the private dining room like a wave rehearsed too many times, smooth, confident, unquestioned. Crystal glasses caught the amber glow of overhead lights, reflecting fragments of wealth in every direction. Outside, Manhattan pulsed at 9:30 p.m., but inside this room on the 47th floor, time slowed to the rhythm of money being discussed in numbers most people never said out loud. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over Italian leather, the other swirling a glass of Bordeaux he hadn't touched. His suit fit like certainty. His presence filled the room without asking permission. Around him sat men who nodded quickly and laughed easily, the kind of laughter that followed power, not humor. And standing just behind his shoulder, quiet as a shadow trained to disappear, was Maya Brooks. She held a tray balanced perfectly at waist height, her posture straight, her expression neutral, the kind of calm that comes from being overlooked so often it becomes a shield. No one had asked her name. No one had needed to. To them, she was part of the setting, like the dim lights or the polished table, something that existed to serve, not to speak. Ethan glanced at her again, this time longer, as if noticing her for the first time not as a person, but as a possibility for amusement. "Come on," he said, his voice light but sharp underneath. "You've been standing there listening all night. You must have picked up something. Where should I invest $50 million right now?" A few eyebrows lifted. Someone smirked. Another guest raised his phone just slightly, not obvious, but not hidden either. The air shifted, just enough to signal that something small had become something else. Maya didn't move right away. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of the tray, not from fear, but from calculation. The room expected hesitation, expected a polite laugh, expected her to play her role. Instead, she looked at him. Not past him, not around him, at him. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but it changed the space between them. Ethan noticed. Not fully, not consciously, but enough for his smile to pause half a second too long. "Well," he added, leaning forward now, interested in his own joke. "What would you do if you had my problem?" The word problem drew another ripple of laughter. $50 million, framed as inconvenience. Maya set the tray down slowly on the edge of the table. The soft clink of glass against wood cut through the noise more cleanly than any raised voice could have. For a brief moment, no one spoke. She could feel the eyes now, not dismissive, not yet respectful, just curious. The kind of curiosity reserved for something unexpected, but still assumed to be harmless. "I wouldn't sign anything tomorrow," she said, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without forcing itself there. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. It didn't explode into silence. It collapsed into it. Ethan blinked once, then again, the smile still on his face, but no longer anchored. "Excuse me," he asked, the tone shifting just slightly, curiosity replacing amusement. Maya didn't rush. She didn't fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it settle, let it do its work. Then she continued. "The company you're meeting with, their last 2 quarterly reports don't match their projected growth. Not by a small margin. By enough to suggest they're covering something." One of the men across the table straightened in his seat. Another lowered his glass without realizing it. The phone that had been recording dipped slightly, forgotten. Ethan's fingers tightened around his glass, the motion small but real. "And you know this how?" he asked, quieter now, not because he chose to be, but because something in the room required it. Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Because the footnotes tell a different story than the headlines," she said. "They always do." No one laughed this time. No one moved. And for the first time that night, the man who owned the room didn't have the next line. The silence did not break. It deepened, like a room suddenly aware of its own weight, and Ethan Caldwell felt it first in his chest before he ever showed it on his face. That subtle shift when confidence meets something it cannot immediately dismiss. His fingers still wrapped around the stem of the glass, but no longer moving, no longer performing, just holding, as if motion itself might give something away. And across the table one of the partners cleared his throat softly, not to speak, but because the air had changed and his body did not know what else to do, while Maya Brooks stood exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, not claiming space yet not surrendering it either, her presence now defined not by service, but by precision, and Ethan leaned in slightly, not enough for anyone to call it interest, but enough that everyone felt it. "That is a strong claim," he said, his voice lower now, controlled, the tone of a man used to challenging analysts, not waitresses. "You are telling me a firm worth over $100 million is hiding something in plain sight?" And Maya did not rush to answer. She let the question sit, because questions, when asked by men like him, were rarely about answers. They were about control, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, untouched by the tension tightening around the table. "Not hiding in plain sight," she said. "Hiding in the parts they assume no one important will read." And that word, important, landed differently this time. Not as an insult, not as a defense, but as a mirror, and one of the men shifted in his seat. Another reached for his phone again but hesitated before lifting it, because this no longer felt like a moment to capture. It felt like one to survive, and Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, the way a man looks at a problem that refuses to behave the way it should. "And you read these reports?" he asked, the question simple, but the implication heavy, and Maya nodded once. Not proudly, not defensively, just factually. "Every quarter," she said. "Public filings are free if you know where to look." And there was no arrogance in her tone, only clarity, the kind that does not need permission to exist, and Ethan let out a small breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite, because something inside him was recalibrating, fast, silently, the way it always had in boardrooms when the stakes were real, and he set his glass down slowly, deliberately, the sound of it touching the table sharper than expected. "Then explain it," he said, not joking now, not testing, but asking, truly asking, and the shift was unmistakable, not just to Maya, but to everyone watching, the power in the room tilting by degrees so small they could be denied, yet large enough to be felt. And Maya stepped forward half a pace, just enough to reach the edge of the table, her hand resting lightly against the polished wood, not claiming it, but steadying herself against it, and she spoke, not faster, not louder, but deeper. "Their growth projections rely on a subsidiary that has not reported independent revenue in 2 quarters, she said. "But they are still counting it as a driver in future forecasts, which means either they expect a sudden turnaround, with no disclosed catalyst, or they are inflating expectations to support valuation." And one of the men across from Ethan frowned, his mind catching up, while another leaned closer to the center of the table, drawn in despite himself, and Ethan's gaze did not leave her, not even for a second. "And which do you think it is?" he asked, quieter now, and Maya met his eyes fully, without hesitation. "If it were a turnaround, they would have hinted at it already," she said. "Investors respond to signals, and silence at that level is not strategy, it is risk." And the word risk hung in the air like a warning no one had planned to hear tonight. And somewhere behind them, a server passed by the doorway, unaware that inside this room, something far more valuable than dinner was being negotiated, not in contracts, not in numbers, but in perception, and Ethan leaned back slowly, the movement measured, controlled, but different now, because the man who had asked a question as a joke was no longer laughing, and for the first time that night, he was not the one leading the conversation, he was following it, and he knew it. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone in the room understood that whatever came next would matter more than anything that had been said before, and Ethan Caldwell felt that pressure settle over his shoulders in a way he had not experienced in years, not in negotiations, not in boardrooms, not even in the early days when every decision carried the weight of survival, because this was different, this was unscripted, uncontrolled, and most unsettling of all, coming from someone he had already decided did not belong in the conversation, and yet here she was, not just in it, but shaping it. And he studied her now with a level of attention that stripped away the assumptions he had made just minutes earlier, noticing the steadiness in her posture, the absence of hesitation in her voice, the way she did not try to impress, only to explain, and that detail alone unsettled him more than any bold claim ever could, because confidence that does not perform is rarely accidental. "What is your name?" he asked finally. The question simple, but the shift behind it unmistakable, and Maya did not answer immediately, not out of defiance, but because the timing mattered, because now the room was listening in a way it had not been before, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity. "Maya," she said, just that. No last name, no elaboration, and something about that restraint held more weight than any title could have. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if committing it to memory. "Maya," he repeated, testing the name in a tone that no longer carried amusement, only focus. "If what you are saying is true, then the valuation I was given is built on unstable ground." And Maya met his gaze without blinking. "Not unstable," she said, "misrepresented." And that word landed harder than the last, sharper, more precise. And one of the men at the table shifted again, this time reaching for his tablet, fingers moving quickly as if trying to confirm what he had just heard, while another leaned closer, eyes narrowing at numbers only he could see. And the quiet hum of analysis began to replace the earlier laughter, subtle at first, then growing, like a current forming beneath still water. And Ethan watched it happen, watched his own team move from spectators to participants in a conversation they had not expected to take seriously, and he felt something unfamiliar settle in, not doubt exactly, but awareness, the kind that forces recalibration, and he turned back to Maya. "Why does no one else see this?" he asked, and this time the question carried something new, not challenge, not skepticism, but curiosity, real curiosity, and Maya allowed herself a small breath before answering, not to gather courage, but to measure the moment. "Because they are not looking for it," she said. "They are looking for confirmation, not contradiction." And the simplicity of it cut deeper than any complex analysis could have, because it was not just about the deal anymore. It was about how decisions were made in rooms like this, how power shaped perception, how expectation filtered reality, and Ethan leaned back again. But this time the movement was different, less about control, more about processing, his eyes drifting briefly to the skyline beyond the glass, the city stretching out in silent indifference to the tension inside the room. And for a moment, he said nothing, and no one rushed to fill the silence, because now they understood its value. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, steadier, stripped of performance. "If I walk away from this deal tomorrow," he said, "I lose leverage, I lose position, and I risk signaling weakness." And Maya nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that. "Yes," she said. "But if you sign it, you risk something bigger." And Ethan's gaze returned to her, sharper now. "Which is?" he asked, and Maya held it, unflinching. "Trust," she said, and the words settled into the room with a weight that numbers could not match, because everyone at that table understood what it meant to lose money. But trust, that was different. That was currency that did not recover easily. And for a long second, no one moved, no one spoke, because the conversation had crossed a line it could not uncross. And Ethan Caldwell, the man who had walked into the room expecting to control every outcome, realized in that moment that the most important decision of his week, maybe his year, was now being shaped by someone he had almost reduced to a joke, and he did not look away. The word trust lingered longer than anything else that had been said that night, not loud, not dramatic, but immovable, like something placed carefully in the center of the table that no one could ignore without consequence. And Ethan Caldwell felt it settle into his thinking with a clarity that numbers alone had not provided, because numbers could be adjusted, reframed, negotiated, but trust, once questioned, had a way of reshaping everything around it. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting for just a moment to the faces around him. Men who had followed his lead for years now sitting in a rare stillness, waiting, not for his command, but for what he would choose to do with what he had just been given. And that shift, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed by him, because leadership, real leadership, was not about always having the answer. It was about recognizing when the answer had already been placed in front of you, even if it came from an unexpected source. And he turned back to Maya, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer casual, but aligned, attentive. "If I wanted to verify what you are saying right now," he said, his voice steady, measured, "where would I start?" And it was not a test anymore, not a challenge. It was a request, clear and direct, and Maya nodded once, as if she had been expecting that question all along, because she had, not specifically from him, but from someone, someday, somewhere, someone willing to listen instead of dismiss. And she reached for the tablet one of the men had set down moments earlier, not grabbing it, not overstepping, but gesturing toward it with quiet confidence. "Pull up their last 2 quarterly filings," she said. "Look at the subsidiary breakdown under revenue attribution." And the man nearest to her reacted instinctively, sliding the tablet across the table toward Ethan, who took it without hesitation, his eyes already scanning the screen as his fingers moved with practiced speed, navigating data he had reviewed before, but now with a different lens, and the room leaned in, physically, collectively, drawn toward the same focal point, the same unfolding realization, and Maya continued, not rushing, not overwhelming, but guiding. "Now compare that to their forward projections," she said, specifically the segment growth tied to that same subsidiary. And Ethan's brow tightened slightly, the smallest visible signal that something was not aligning the way it should, and one of the partners shifted closer, peering over his shoulder, another quietly opening his own device to follow along, and the quiet hum of verification filled the space, replacing conversation, replacing ego, replacing everything that had defined the room just minutes earlier. And then it happened, not with a dramatic reaction, not with raised voices, but with a pause, a stillness in Ethan's hands as his scrolling stopped, his eyes fixed on a line of data that no longer made sense in the context it had been presented, and he looked up, not quickly, not sharply, but slowly, deliberately, his gaze finding Maya again. And this time there was no trace of amusement, no hint of dismissal, only recognition. "This does not reconcile," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for everyone to hear. And Maya held his gaze, not triumphant, not validated, just steady, because this moment was not about proving herself. It was about revealing something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. And one of the men across the table leaned back in his chair, a quiet breath escaping him as he processed the implication, while another shook his head slightly, more in disbelief at what had been missed than at what had been found. And Ethan set the tablet down slowly, his fingers lingering on its edge for just a second longer than necessary, as if grounding himself in the reality of what he had just uncovered. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not louder, not sharper, but deeper. "How long have you known this?" he asked, and Maya answered without hesitation. "Long enough to know it is not an accident," she said, and the room absorbed that in silence, because intent, implied or real, changed everything. And Ethan leaned back once more, but this time the movement was not about distance. It was about perspective, his eyes briefly lifting to the skyline again before returning to the table, to Maya, to the decision now fully in front of him. And for the first time that night, he did not rush to fill the space with words, because now he understood that the most powerful move in a room like this was not always speaking. Sometimes it was choosing when not to. No one reached for their drink now, not because they had lost interest, but because something far more intoxicating had taken hold of the room, a realization unfolding in real time, quiet but irreversible. And Ethan Caldwell felt it with a clarity that cut through years of instinct, because this was not just about a flawed deal anymore. It was about the process that had allowed it to pass unquestioned, the assumptions that had gone unchallenged, and most of all, the voice that had almost been ignored. And he let that sit for a moment, not speaking, not reacting, just allowing the weight of it to settle fully before he moved, because every decision he made from this point forward would carry more than financial consequence. It would define how this moment was remembered, not just by him, but by everyone watching. And slowly, deliberately, he pushed the tablet aside, not dismissing it, but acknowledging that the data had already done its work, and his attention returned to Maya, steady, focused, no longer searching for flaws, but for understanding. "You said this is not an accident," he said, his voice calm but firm, the tone of someone who had stepped past doubt and into evaluation. "What makes you certain of that?" And the question was different now, not defensive, not skeptical, but precise. And Maya met it with the same composure she had carried since the moment she chose to speak, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, because this was not new territory for her. This was simply the first time someone had allowed her to finish. Because patterns like this require coordination, she said. And coordination requires intent. And a subtle shift moved through the room, not visible in grand gestures, but in small details, a chair adjusting, a breath held a second longer, a glance exchanged between men who understood exactly what she was implying without needing it spelled out, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because intent meant liability, and liability meant exposure. And exposure meant risk far beyond the numbers on the page, and he nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, processing it. And then he asked the question that no longer belonged to a joke. If I walk away tonight, he said, what happens next? And Maya did not hesitate, not because the answer was simple, but because she had already thought through it long before this room existed for her. They will push harder, she said. Urgency, revised terms, pressure to close quickly. And one of the men at the table let out a quiet breath, recognizing the tactic immediately, while another gave a slight nod, his expression shifting from curiosity to confirmation. And Maya continued, her voice steady, grounded, because once doubt enters, time becomes their enemy, not yours. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat on the table, the posture of someone fully engaged, no longer observing, but participating. And if I delay, he asked, if I asked for clarification, and Maya's response came just as measured, then you change the balance, she said. You move from reacting to leading. And that word, leading, settled differently than anything else had, because it spoke directly to who Ethan believed himself to be. Not just a man with capital, but a man with control. And for the first time that night, control did not come from dominating the room. It came from listening to the right voice. And he held her gaze for a long second, not evaluating, not challenging, but acknowledging. And around them, the room remained still, attentive, because everyone understood that this was no longer a conversation between a billionaire and a waitress. It was a decision point, one that would ripple beyond this table, beyond this night. And Ethan finally leaned back, the movement slow, deliberate, his eyes briefly lowering before returning to her. And when he spoke again, there was no trace of the man who had laughed earlier, only someone recalibrating in real time. You have just changed the trajectory of a $120 million decision, he said, his voice quiet but clear, and Maya did not react with surprise or pride or relief. She simply held her position, because for her, this was not about changing his world, it was about revealing it, and the difference mattered. And in that moment, Ethan Caldwell understood something he had not expected to learn that night. That insight did not announce itself, it did not demand attention, it waited, patiently, until someone was willing to hear it. And once heard, it could not be unheard. The room did not return to what it had been before. It could not, because once a certain kind of clarity enters a space like that, it changes the architecture of every conversation that follows. And Ethan Caldwell felt that shift settle into something more permanent, not just a moment of surprise, but a recalibration of instinct, the kind that only happens when certainty is challenged by something undeniable. And he sat there for a second longer than expected, not speaking, not performing, just thinking, which in itself was enough to signal to everyone around him that the tone of the evening had permanently changed. And when he finally moved, it was not toward his glass or his phone, but toward intention. We are not signing anything tomorrow, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that did not require reinforcement, and the words moved through the room like a quiet verdict, one that no one questioned, because they had all seen the same data, heard the same reasoning, felt the same shift, and one of the partners nodded immediately. Another closed his tablet without hesitation, the decision accepted not because it was safe, but because it was now clear. And Ethan's gaze returned to Maya, not as an afterthought, not as a formality, but as a focal point. You just saved us from making a very expensive mistake, he said, his voice steady, stripped of ego, and there was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just a recognition that something significant had occurred without needing to be announced. And Maya did not step forward, did not soften, did not react in any way that sought validation, because for her, this moment was not about being right. It was about being heard. And those were not the same thing. And Ethan studied her again, but this time differently, not scanning for credibility, not measuring worth, but trying to understand how someone standing in that position had seen what his entire team had missed. "Where did you learn to read filings like that?" he asked, and the question carried something new, not curiosity alone, but respect beginning to form beneath it, and Maya answered simply. "I studied finance," she said, "a few years ago." And the room absorbed that quietly, because it filled in a piece of the puzzle without completing it, and Ethan leaned forward slightly. "And now you are here," he said, not as a judgment, but as an observation, and Maya gave a small nod, not defensive, not explanatory, just acknowledging reality. And for a moment, Ethan said nothing, because the gap between those 2 points, studied finance and standing here, said more than any detailed explanation could. And he looked around the table briefly, as if confirming something internally, before returning his attention to her. "Come sit," he said, gesturing toward an empty chair at the table. And the request was simple, but the implication was not, because in a room like that, where seats were not just furniture but symbols, that gesture carried weight. And every eye shifted to Maya, waiting, watching, measuring what she would do, and she paused, just for a second, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because she understood exactly what that invitation meant, not just inclusion, but acknowledgement. And slowly, she shook her head, not dismissively, not disrespectfully, but with quiet clarity. "I am working," she said, her voice calm, grounded. "And this is not my table." And the response landed with a different kind of impact, not defiance, not humility, but self-possession, the kind that does not need to be elevated to feel valued. And Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried understanding, because for the first time that night, he was not trying to place her within his world. He was beginning to recognize that she already had one of her own, and that it did not require his permission to exist. And around them, the room remained still, not awkward, not tense, but aware, because something had shifted beyond a single decision, beyond a single conversation, something quieter, deeper, the realization that power did not always look the way they expected it to, and that sometimes the most valuable voice in the room was the one they almost never heard. The moment did not end when the conversation slowed. It stretched, quietly unfolding into something that lingered long after the words had settled, and Ethan Caldwell felt it follow him even as the dinner resumed. Because although plates were replaced and glasses refilled, nothing returned to its original rhythm. The laughter that once came easily now measured, the conversations more deliberate, as if everyone in the room had become aware of something they could not unsee. And Maya Brooks moved again between tables, her steps as steady as before, her presence once again blending into the background. But the difference now was not in her, it was in how she was perceived, because invisibility, once broken, never fully returns. And Ethan watched her more than he spoke for the remainder of the evening. Not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough that his focus drifted whenever she crossed his line of sight, as if his mind was still trying to reconcile the version of her he had created with the reality she had revealed. And at exactly 10:47 p.m., he stood, the movement smooth, controlled, signaling the close of the evening, and one by one, the others followed, chairs sliding back, jackets adjusted, devices gathered, the quiet choreography of people accustomed to leaving before the night ever truly ended. And as they moved toward the exit, Ethan paused, just briefly, his attention shifting once more toward the floor where Maya was collecting empty glasses, her expression unchanged, her pace consistent, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. And for a moment, he simply watched, not interrupting, not calling out, just observing the way she returned to her role without hesitation, without expectation. And something about that steadiness held more weight than anything she had said earlier, because it confirmed that her value was not situational. It was constant. And he turned away without speaking, stepping into the elevator with the others, the doors closing with a soft chime that sealed the night behind him, but not the decision ahead. And as the elevator descended, the reflection in the mirrored walls showed a man quieter than the one who had entered hours before, his posture unchanged, but his expression carrying something new, not doubt, not uncertainty, but awareness, the kind that shifts priorities without announcement. And when the doors opened to the lobby, the city air waiting beyond the glass, cool and alive, Ethan did not reach for his phone immediately, did not resume the rhythm of calls and confirmations that usually followed meetings like this. Instead, he stepped outside, paused for just a second, and looked up at the skyline, the same view that had framed the evening now stretching above him, unchanged, indifferent, and he let out a slow breath, because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the deal. He was thinking about the moment before it, the moment he almost dismissed, the moment that had quietly redirected everything. And somewhere above him, on the 47th floor, Maya Brooks continued her shift, clearing tables, resetting spaces, moving through the same routine she had mastered long before this night. And yet, the trajectory of two lives had shifted in opposite directions without either of them announcing it. Because while Ethan walked away with a decision that would reshape his business, Maya remained exactly where she was, not because she lacked the ability to leave, but because the world had not yet made space for what she carried, and that contrast, silent but undeniable, lingered longer than any conversation, because it revealed something deeper than a single interaction. It revealed the distance between recognition and opportunity, and how often one arrived without the other. And as the night continued and the city moved forward, without pause, one thing remained certain, that what had happened in that room was not finished. It had only just begun. The night did not end for Ethan Caldwell when he stepped into his car. It followed him, quiet but persistent, sitting in the space between his thoughts as the city lights stretched past the window in long, blurred lines. Because some decisions do not arrive with urgency, they arrive with clarity, and clarity demands action. And by 6:12 a.m. the next morning, before the city had fully shaken off the night, Ethan was already seated at the head of a different table, this one colder, sharper, filled with people who spoke in numbers before they spoke in words. And the deal that had once felt inevitable now sat in front of him like a question waiting to be answered differently. And as the presentation began, projections displayed, confidence rehearsed, Ethan did not interrupt immediately. He listened, the way he had not listened the night before, not for confirmation, but for contradiction, and it did not take long. Because once something has been seen, it cannot be unseen. And when the presenter reached the section Maya had pointed to, the subsidiary, the projected growth, the quiet assumption buried beneath confident language, Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled, his voice calm but precise. "Walk me through this line again," he said, and the room shifted, just enough to register that something had changed, and the presenter hesitated for half a second before continuing. But that half second was enough, because hesitation in rooms like that spoke louder than certainty ever could, and Ethan listened, not to the explanation, but to the space between the words, the gaps, the inconsistencies, the subtle deflections that once would have passed unnoticed. And when the explanation ended, he did not respond immediately. He let the silence settle, let the discomfort rise, let the room feel the weight of what had not been said, and then he spoke. "Your projections rely on revenue that has not been independently verified in 2 quarters, he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement, and the reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but contained, controlled, a tightening of posture, a quick exchange of glances, the kind of response that confirmed more than any admission could. And Ethan held the moment, not pressing, not escalating, just allowing the truth to reveal itself in the absence of denial. And within minutes, the tone of the meeting shifted, urgency replaced by caution, confidence replaced by explanation. And what had been positioned as a straightforward agreement became something else entirely. Something slower, more careful, more exposed. And by the time the meeting concluded, the deal was no longer on the table, not rejected, not accepted, but paused indefinitely. And as the others gathered their materials, voices lower now, conversations more guarded, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the same numbers that had looked so convincing just hours before. And he understood then that the difference between loss and preservation had not come from experience alone, not from instinct, not from the team he had built, but from a voice he had almost dismissed, and that realization carried more weight than the decision itself. because it forced him to confront something deeper than strategy, something about how value was recognized, and how often it was overlooked. And later that afternoon, without announcement, without schedule, Ethan returned to the restaurant. Not in the evening, not during the rush, but in the quiet hours between, when the tables were being reset and the city had not yet filled the space with noise. And he walked in without his usual presence. No entourage, no attention, just a man stepping into a place that had shifted something he could not ignore. And behind the counter, Maya Brooks was there. The same uniform, the same steady posture, the same quiet focus, as if the night before had not altered her world at all. And for a moment, Ethan stood there, not speaking, not announcing himself, just observing the contrast between what had changed for him and what had not changed for her. And then he stepped forward, not as the man who had entered the room the night before, but as someone who now understood that the most important conversations do not always happen where power expects them to. And when Maya looked up, meeting his gaze again, there was no surprise in her expression, only recognition, because some people do not need a second moment to understand the first one mattered, and the distance between them, measured not in steps, but in perspective, felt smaller now, not because their worlds had merged, but because one of them had finally chosen to see the other clearly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the weight of what had already been said still lingered between them, quiet and undeniable. And Ethan Caldwell stood there without the shield of a boardroom, without the rhythm of control he had mastered for years, just a man facing the consequence of a moment he almost overlooked. And Maya Brooks met his gaze the same way she had the night before, steady, grounded, unchanged, as if nothing about her required adjustment to meet him where he now stood. And that alone shifted the balance more than any words could, because consistency in a world that constantly repositions people is a form of power most do not recognize until they see it. And Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice lower than it had been in the dining room, not because he lacked confidence, but because he no longer needed volume to be heard. I walked away from the deal, he said, simple, direct, and Maya gave a small nod. Not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the outcome as something that followed naturally from the truth. And for a second, Ethan almost smiled, not out of pride, but out of realization, because he understood that what felt like a major decision to him had been an obvious conclusion to her from the beginning. And that difference in perspective said more than any explanation ever could. And he took a step closer, not to close distance, but to clarify intention. You were right, he said. And the words were not heavy, not dramatic, but precise, the kind that do not seek reaction, only recognition. And Maya did not respond immediately, because she understood something he was just beginning to see, that being right was never the point. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty. I did not need to be right, she said. You just needed to see it. And the simplicity of that landed deeper than any compliment, because it reframed the entire interaction, not as a moment of validation, but as a moment of visibility. And Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, because in that sentence was something he had missed for years, that value does not increase when it is acknowledged, it only becomes visible. And he reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, not flashy, not presented with performance, just an object carrying opportunity, and he held it out toward her. Come work with us, he said, not as an offer built on impulse, but as a decision grounded in what he had witnessed. And the air between them shifted again, not tense, not pressured, but focused, because now the question had moved from recognition to possibility. And Maya looked at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. And for a moment, it seemed like time paused just long enough for the weight of the decision to settle fully, not rushed, not influenced, just considered. And then she spoke, not rejecting, not accepting, but clarifying. You are offering me a seat at your table, she said, her voice even, thoughtful. And Ethan nodded once, certain, because in his world, that was the highest form of acknowledgement, the clearest path forward. And Maya held his gaze for a second longer before responding. But last night, she continued, I already had something more important. And the words did not carry defiance, only truth. And Ethan felt that before he fully understood it, because there was no challenge in her tone, only clarity. And she finished, I had a voice. And the sentence settled between them with a quiet finality that did not need explanation, because it revealed something deeper than position, deeper than opportunity, something about self-worth that did not depend on access. And Ethan stood there, processing it, not defensively, not reactively, but openly, because for the first time, he was not trying to shape the outcome, he was trying to understand it, and slowly, he lowered the card, not withdrawing the offer, but recognizing that the value of it had shifted, and he nodded once more, this time not as agreement, but as respect, because he understood now that what she had given him could not be reciprocated with a title alone, and Maya returned to her work, not dismissing him, not lingering, just continuing the rhythm of her world with the same steadiness she had always carried. And Ethan remained there for a second longer before turning to leave, the city waiting beyond the glass just as it had the night before. But something within him permanently altered, not in what he owned, but in what he recognized. And as the door closed behind him, one truth remained, quiet but undeniable, that insight does not ask for permission, and dignity does not wait to be invited. And sometimes, the most powerful shift in a room happens not when someone speaks louder, but when someone finally listens.